A starving maid like you will never lay a finger on my granddaughter again. So get out of my estate before I throw you to the dogs." The voice of Eleanor cracked like a harsh whip beneath the scorching California sun, bouncing off the white pillars of the grand estate and stabbing into Amanda's chest like red-hot knives. Amanda, barely 28 years old, clutched her two battered suitcases tightly against her body, her hands trembling uncontrollably as the light blue nanny uniform she had worn with immense pride for 3 months now weighed on her shoulders like a heavy shroud. She pleaded with a broken voice, swearing upon the sacred memory of her late mother that she had never stolen anything, begging the cruel matriarch to understand that little Rachel needed her because the child was just beginning to trust again. Eleanor took a step forward, her chin held high, and the heavy gold rings gleaming on her bony fingers, declaring that her granddaughter was of high society, and did not need a pathetic beggar teaching her rural songs or filling her head with poor people's illusions. The elderly woman claimed she had found her late daughter-in-law, Emily's diamond necklace, hidden among Amanda's meager belongings, stating coldly that this alone was enough proof that Amanda was a filthy thief who belonged either rotting in a jail cell or tossed out into the unforgiving streets. Tears cascaded silently down Amanda's flushed cheeks as she softly murmured that she had never put that necklace in her bags, insisting that someone had intentionally planted it there to ruin her because they all knew she loved that little girl as if she were her own flesh and blood. "That is exactly why you are leaving." The wealthy matriarch responded sharply, and for one fleeting fraction of a second, an emotion closely resembling genuine terror flashed across her icy eyes before her expression hardened into an impenetrable wall of aristocratic stone. Eleanor snapped her fingers and ordered Sam and Austin, two rugged ranch hands who worked the sprawling vineyards, to take the young woman away, their eyes glued to the dusty ground in deep shame as they carried her suitcases and escorted her toward the massive wrought iron gates. Neither of the hard-working men dared to look her in the eye as they abandoned her on the other side of the boundary, leaving her standing alone on the dirt road beneath the blinding midday sun more than 6 miles away from the nearest small town. The heavy iron gates slammed shut with a definitive metallic clang that sounded exactly like a death sentence, leaving Amanda standing paralyzed for a long moment, completely unsure of which direction she should even begin to walk. The dry dust of the rural California road scratched at her throat, while the endless rows of lush green grapevines stretched out in perfect silent lines until they disappeared into the distant rolling hills, looking utterly beautiful and completely indifferent to her sudden agonizing misfortune. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she picked up her heavy bags and began the agonizing trek, walking for nearly an hour until she reached a dilapidated wooden bus stop, leaning against a crooked telephone pole which offered the only meager sliver of shade against the relentless heat. She collapsed onto the crumbling concrete bench, her body entirely exhausted, her aching feet swollen inside her worn-out shoes, realizing with a heavy heart that she had no money to her name other than a few stray coins jingling uselessly in her apron pocket. She had absolutely nowhere to go as her only remaining family member, a distant aunt living in a neighboring state, had passed away during the bitter cold of the previous winter, leaving her entirely untethered in a massive, indifferent world. Finally alone, with no harsh eyes left to judge her, Amanda covered her face with her trembling hands and shattered completely from the inside out, weeping bitterly for the gross injustice and for her permanently stained reputation. But more than anything else, she cried uncontrollably for little Rachel, because, as the salty tears slipped between her fingers, the precious memories of the last few months returned to her mind, crashing like powerful ocean waves. She clearly remembered the very first time she saw the little girl 3 months ago in that immense, echoing mansion. Rachel was merely 6 years old, possessing enormous, dark eyes that were brimming with an unbearable sorrow that Amanda instantly recognized within her own soul. The older housekeeper had warned her in a hushed whisper on her first day that the child simply did not speak, having not uttered a single word since her mother Emily passed away in a tragic accident nearly 2 years ago. They had brought in the most expensive doctors from San Francisco, psychologists from the capital, and even renowned specialists from across the country, but none of them had achieved anything, leaving the little girl completely extinguished and moving through the dark halls like a silent, sorrowful ghost. The previous nannies had all surrendered one by one, collecting their handsome paychecks and fleeing the property, entirely incapable of enduring the sepulchral silence of the grieving child and the tyrannical, iron-fisted rule of her grandmother Eleanor. But Amanda adamantly refused to give up, choosing not to speak to Rachel as if she were a broken patient, but rather talking to her like a normal, beloved little girl, singing the tender lullabies her own mother used to sing, and bringing her vibrant wildflowers from the fields. Sitting on the floor beside her without demanding a single thing, Amanda told her magical stories of brave princesses and magnificent birds that learned to fly only after believing they never could, and slowly, a beautiful miracle began to unfold. It started with a simple glance when Rachel began searching for Amanda whenever she entered the room, progressing to a tiny hand holding onto her fingers for hours, and finally culminating just 3 days ago with a brilliant, crystal-clear laugh ringing out in the blooming garden. Now, sitting at the lonely bus stop, Amanda finally understood the terrifying truth: the wealthy matriarch had not fired her over a stolen necklace, but rather because the child was miraculously beginning to heal. And for some dark, unfathomable reason, Rachel's recovery terrified Eleanor to her very core. The golden afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, melancholic shadows across the deserted dirt road. Yet not a single bus had passed by the crumbling wooden shelter where the devastated young woman sat. Amanda was entirely lost in her own sorrowful thoughts when she suddenly heard the low, elegant purr of an incredibly expensive engine steadily approaching from the distance, kicking up a magnificent cloud of amber dust. She slowly raised her tear-streaked face to see a sleek, polished black sedan rolling gracefully down the rugged path, looking entirely out of place, like a majestic panther wandering through a forgotten wasteland of poverty. Against all logical odds, the luxurious vehicle began to slow its pace, the tires crunching softly against the gravel until it came to a complete halt just a few feet away from where she sat, clutching her worn-out belongings. Amanda hastily wiped the tears from her flushed cheeks with the back of her hand and instinctively tried to smooth her disheveled hair, feeling completely bewildered as the heavy driver's door smoothly swung open. Out stepped a tall, profoundly handsome man, appearing to be in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that refused to hold a single wrinkle, radiating an aura of undeniable authority. His dark hair was neatly swept back, framing a strong jawline and piercing intense eyes that were clearly accustomed to giving orders and demanding absolute obedience from everyone who crossed his intimidating path. Yet in this particular moment, those striking eyes held no harshness whatsoever. Instead, they were wide with genuine bewilderment as he stared at her battered suitcases and the unmistakable light blue uniform with the white apron. That specific uniform, bearing the intricately embroidered crest of the sprawling vineyard estate on the breast pocket, was worn in only one place in the entire world, and that place was his own private home. Maxwell took a hesitant step toward her, entirely unable to comprehend the bizarre scene unfolding before him. One of the caretakers from his heavily guarded estate, the very woman supposedly looking after his only daughter, stranded and weeping on the shoulder of a deserted country road. "Excuse me," he said, with a deep resonant voice that surprisingly wavered with uncertainty, gesturing toward the embroidered crest on her chest as he asked if she was currently employed at his family's grand estate. Amanda instantly jumped to her feet, her heart galloping wildly against her ribs, because while she had never formally met this man, his regal posture and the undeniable resemblance told her exactly who he was. "Yes, sir," she replied respectfully, her voice trembling slightly as she explained that, until a few hours ago, she had been the dedicated nanny, entirely responsible for the daily care of little Rachel. The man's stoic face transformed instantly, a profound wave of raw emotion crashing through his serious eyes as he took another urgent step forward, practically stumbling over his own desperate words. "You took care of my daughter, my little Rachel," he demanded, his chest heaving as he introduced himself as Maxwell, the owner of the estate, and the heartbroken father of the silent little girl. He stared at her bags, the dusty uniform, and the dried tear tracks on her youthful face, his commanding voice suddenly reducing to a fragile, wavering whisper as the heavy confusion continued to mount. He explained that he had been away for 2 exhausting weeks closing crucial business deals in New York, and had spoken to his mother on the telephone merely 3 days ago. His mother had casually mentioned that they had hired a new extraordinary young woman who was working absolute miracles, and that for the very first time in 2 agonizing years, his precious daughter had actually laughed out loud. He swallowed hard, his eyes pleading for a logical explanation, as he demanded to know why the woman who had brought joy back to his child was now sitting abandoned in the middle of nowhere with all her worldly possessions. The warm California air seemed to freeze between them as Amanda felt her heart lodge firmly in her throat, realizing this powerful man knew absolutely nothing about the cruel injustice that had transpired that very morning. He had no idea that his own mother had maliciously thrown her out like garbage, nor did he know about the vile accusations, and seeing the desperate hope burning in his eyes, Amanda knew her next words would alter the course of their lives permanently. "Mr. Maxwell," she began, her voice shaking but resolute, "I did not abandon my post. I was forcefully thrown out of your home by your mother, who falsely accused me of stealing your late wife's diamond necklace." Maxwell stood completely paralyzed in the dusty road, the hot wind rustling the endless rows of grapevines around them as a deeply buried, terrifying suspicion slowly began to take concrete form in his mind. "My mother has fired 11 different nannies in the span of 2 years," he murmured aloud, rubbing a tired hand across his face as the devastating realization finally washed over him. Every single time one of them managed to get slightly close to Rachel, she miraculously found some convenient excuse to terminate them, making me believe it was simply her demanding standards. "But you made my child laugh." He looked up at Amanda, really seeing her for the first time, not as a lowly employee, but as a remarkable human being expressing his profound shock that his daughter had shown emotion after 2 years of complete devastating silence. "Get in the car right now," he commanded, his words not carrying the weight of a boss's order, but rather the desperate plea of a broken father, determined to unearth the truth, promising to take her back and fix the injustice immediately. The heavy iron gates of the grand estate loomed at the end of the long driveway, making Amanda's stomach twist into painful knots, as she recognized the familiar white walls and the embroidered crests on the uniforms of the bewildered ranch hands. They scrambled to swing the massive gates open, absolutely astonished to see their powerful boss returning in his luxury sedan, with the exact same young woman they had personally escorted off the property just hours prior. The sleek vehicle glided to a smooth halt directly in front of the sweeping stone staircase, where Eleanor stood waiting like a tyrannical queen upon her throne, wearing a severe dark dress and a face pale, with barely contained venomous fury. "Maxwell!" she exclaimed, descending the steps with a forced smile praising his early arrival, before sharply demanding to know why on earth he had brought the thieving woman back to their respectable home. Mother Maxwell interrupted, stepping out of the vehicle with an eerie, terrifying calmness that was far more intimidating than any explosive shouting, declaring that they were going to talk inside, and they were going to speak nothing but the absolute truth. "There is nothing to discuss." Eleanor snapped defensively, insisting she had found Emily's precious jewelry hidden in the girls' bags, to which Maxwell immediately countered by asking why she was digging through an employee's private belongings in the first place. The piercing question dropped between them like a heavy stone, plunging into a bottomless well, leaving the iron-willed matriarch completely speechless for the very first time in her incredibly privileged, commanding life. It was precisely in that tense, suffocating moment of silence that the entire world seemed to shift on its axis. Because at the very top of the grand stone staircase, a tiny, fragile figure suddenly appeared. Rachel, wearing an immaculate white dress, had heard the unmistakable sound of her father's car engine from her bedroom, and had sprinted out into the hallway, completely barefoot, entirely unnoticed by the distracted household staff. The little girl peered through the ornate iron balustrade, her enormous dark eyes locking instantly onto Amanda's familiar blue uniform, causing her small chest to heave up and down with sudden, overwhelming emotion. Releasing her grip on the railing, the child did the unthinkable. She launched herself down the steep stone stairs, clumsily dodging her shocked grandmother, stumbling, recovering, and sprinting with all her might, directly toward the young Nanny. "Be careful," one of the maids shrieked in absolute terror. But Rachel did not slow down for a single second, throwing herself recklessly into Amanda's waiting arms as the young woman dropped to her knees on the sharp gravel to catch her. "Amanda!" The child's voice suddenly rang out, sounding slightly high-pitched, incredibly raspy, and terribly fragile from 2 solid years of total disuse, yet it echoed perfectly clear across the stunned courtyard. "Amanda, please do not go away. Please do not leave me alone." She cried out, burying her face into the nanny's neck, as time itself seemed to completely halt for everyone standing in the sun-drenched driveway. The elderly housekeeper dropped a silver tray that shattered against the cobblestones. The ranch hands immediately ripped off their hats in sheer reverence, and Eleanor stumbled backward, her face drained of all color, as if she had just witnessed a terrifying ghost. Maxwell, the ruthless businessman who managed massive empires without ever blinking, and who had refused to shed a single tear, even at his own wife's tragic funeral, stood entirely petrified in the center of the courtyard, tears freely overflowing from his wide eyes. His precious daughter had finally spoken, after 2 agonizing years of absolute soul-crushing silence, and the very first word she chose to utter was not father, nor was it grandmother. It was the name of the destitute woman they had thrown to the curb. "You came back for me." The little girl sobbed relentlessly, clinging to Amanda with a desperate iron grip, while Amanda held her tightly against her chest, weeping uncontrollably and promising the child that nobody would ever separate them again. Maxwell took a slow, trembling step toward the kneeling pair, his voice completely broken, and his handsome face soaked with tears, proudly declaring to his mother that this remarkable woman was never leaving their home ever again. Eleanor, looking as white as a fresh sheet of paper, stared at her weeping granddaughter, then shifted her gaze to the kneeling Nanny, her cold eyes filling with a newly birthed, deeply dangerous hatred that went far beyond mere wounded pride. This was no longer just a simple matter of aristocratic arrogance. This poor, insignificant girl had somehow become the only living person capable of making the child speak, and Rachel held the most dangerous, devastating secret in the family's dark history. That night, under Maxwell's strict, unyielding orders, Amanda was officially reinstated and moved back into the bedroom directly adjacent to Rachel's, while Eleanor watched the bags being carried up the stairs, with her lips pressed into a bloodless, terrifying line. Rachel adamantly refused to let go of Amanda's hand, for the entire evening trailing behind her through the massive corridors like a remarkably happy miniature shadow, occasionally dropping a single word like water or more, causing the maids to cross themselves in sheer awe. During the extravagant evening meal, Maxwell shattered another strict generational rule by ordering an extra place setting at the grand dining table, insisting with a warm smile that Amanda sit beside them as an honored guest rather than a servant. Eleanor hissed her furious disapproval, claiming it disrupted the natural order of their high-class home, but Maxwell silenced her instantly, stating coldly that his late father's rules had never once managed to cure his daughter's crippling silence, leaving the old woman seething. While the bizarre family dinner unfolded in the main dining room, Eleanor locked herself securely inside her soundproofed study, aggressively dialing a private telephone number she knew entirely by heart, desperate to summon immediate reinforcements. "Catherine?" "It is Eleanor," the older woman whispered sharply into the receiver, her tone dripping with venom as she demanded her wealthy younger friend travel to the estate the very next morning because a massive problem named Amanda had invaded their lives. Eleanor warned the socialite that the poor girl was rapidly embedding herself into Maxwell's vulnerable heart, and if they did not act swiftly to destroy her, the lowly maid would undoubtedly become the next lady of the grand estate. The smooth, sugary voice of Catherine purred through the telephone line, assuring the frantic matriarch not to worry, promising she would arrive by noon to eliminate the nuisance, boasting that she knew perfectly well how to dispose of women who dared to stand in her way. Catherine arrived precisely on time the following day, stepping out of a blindingly red sports car wearing an ivory linen suit that easily cost more than Amanda could earn in 3 grueling years of physical labor. Flashing a meticulously rehearsed, dazzling smile, Catherine threw her arms open the moment Maxwell stepped onto the porch, loudly proclaiming she had rushed from the city because she simply could not bear the thought of her oldest, dearest friend suffering through difficult times alone. Maxwell greeted her with polite but noticeably distant courtesy, fully aware that his mother had been forcefully pushing this elegant, wealthy woman as a potential replacement wife for months, though he currently had absolutely zero patience for romantic games. As Catherine strutted gracefully into the grand foyer, her calculating eyes instantly locked onto Amanda, who was descending the sweeping staircase with little Rachel holding tightly to her hand. The brief encounter lasted only a fraction of a second, yet both women instantly understood the silent declaration of war. Catherine raked her judgmental gaze over the plain blue uniform, while Amanda easily recognized the sharp, dangerous edge of a vicious rival hiding beneath the perfect makeup. "So you are the famous miracle worker," Catherine sneered sweetly, leaning down to offer Rachel a fake enthusiastic greeting, but the terrified little girl immediately shrank back, hiding completely behind Amanda's legs and gripping the apron tightly. The socialite's perfect smile cracked for just a millimeter as she noted the child's obvious rejection, making a passive-aggressive comment about how strange it was that the girl trusted a total stranger over her own lifelong family friends. Over the next several days, a quiet, ruthless psychological war ravaged the estate, with Catherine permanently attaching herself to Maxwell's side, constantly reminding him of their shared aristocratic background while carefully dropping poisonous subtle hints about Amanda's supposed manipulative true nature. Catherine maliciously suggested that impoverished girls often knew exactly how to emotionally manipulate vulnerable, wealthy children simply to secure a permanent, comfortable roof over their own heads, urging Maxwell to be extremely cautious about who he allowed to sleep under his roof. Realizing her subtle whispers were not working fast enough, Catherine escalated her cruel tactics, sneaking into Amanda's small bedroom while the nanny was in the kitchen, aggressively tearing the drawers apart and leaving a thick envelope stuffed with $100 bills on the pillow. Attached to the cash was a typewritten note demanding Amanda take the money and disappear into the night, threatening that if she stayed, she would lose absolutely everything, including her personal freedom and her life. Amanda calmly picked up the heavy envelope, marched directly down the grand staircase, and tossed it onto the foyer table in front of the entire household staff, declaring in a steady, fearless voice that her loyalty could not be bought by cowards. Catherine, pretending to casually read a high-fashion magazine on the velvet sofa, arched a perfectly plucked eyebrow and offered a smile made of pure ice, realizing with growing frustration that the poor nanny possessed a spine forged from unbreakable steel. Undeterred by the nasty games, Amanda poured her entire soul into caring for Rachel, celebrating every tiny victory as the little girl began to paint colorful pictures and whisper entire sentences, blooming beautifully like a resilient flower after a devastating, endless winter. One rainy evening, Maxwell quietly entered the magnificent library to find Amanda sitting on the plush rug, humming an old country melody, while helping Rachel build a towering castle out of wooden blocks, the sound filling his empty heart with unfamiliar warmth. He sat down on the floor beside them, completely ignoring his expensive suit, softly confessing to Amanda that she had miraculously resurrected his dead household, and the profound lingering gaze they shared sent a dangerous electric thrill straight through Amanda's chest. That very night, however, a terrifying incident abruptly shattered the fragile peace. Rachel woke up screaming uncontrollably from a horrific nightmare, thrashing violently in her bed while completely drenched in cold, shivering sweat. Amanda sprinted into the dark room, scooping the trembling child into her arms, rocking her gently, and whispering soothing words until the frantic sobbing slowly subsided into small, exhausted hiccups. When Amanda softly asked what had frightened her, Rachel's enormous eyes widened with pure, unadulterated terror as she gripped Amanda's collar, whispering in a raspy, haunting voice that she remembered the stares, the screaming, and the violent fight. It was not an accident. Amanda, the 6-year-old child, confessed, trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. I was hiding, and I saw grandmother push my mommy down the stairs. Amanda's blood instantly turned to freezing ice inside her veins as the horrifying weight of the little girl's whispered confession crashed down upon her shoulders like a collapsing concrete building. The terrifying truth finally made perfect sense. Eleanor had not fired 11 nannies because of high standards, but because she lived in absolute terror that someone would stay long enough to cure the child's silence, allowing the dark, murderous secret to finally escape. Amanda realized she was holding a literal ticking time bomb, knowing she could not simply run to Maxwell with such a devastating accusation based solely on a traumatized child's nightmare, as Eleanor would easily crush her and lock the little girl away forever. She made a silent, sacred vow to protect Rachel with her own life, deciding she needed undeniable concrete proof before she could expose the powerful, ruthless matriarch for the cold-blooded killer she truly was. The very next afternoon, Catherine executed her most vicious trap, yet storming into the elegant dining room during a formal lunch, and dramatically slamming her hands on the table, wailing that her priceless diamond ring had been stolen from her private vanity. An incredibly thick, suffocating silence immediately descended upon the room as Catherine, squeezing out perfectly timed crocodile tears, suggested with fake sympathy that the only logical suspect was the new employee who had unrestricted access to every single bedroom in the grand house. Eleanor enthusiastically seized the golden opportunity, her eyes gleaming with wicked triumph, as she ordered a thorough immediate search of the nanny's quarters to finally cleanse their respectable home of the filthy, thieving rat she claimed had infiltrated their ranks. Amanda stood tall, her chin held high despite the terrifying pounding of her heart, boldly inviting them to search whatever they wished. Entirely confident she had touched nothing, yet deeply aware that a trap had already been meticulously laid. The entire family marched up the grand staircase, Catherine leading the aggressive charge with a barely concealed smirk, marching straight to Amanda's modest wooden wardrobe and plunging her manicured hands deeply into the neatly folded stacks of plain cotton clothing. With a theatrical gasp of horror, Catherine ripped her hand back, but instead of producing the supposedly stolen diamond ring, she pulled out a crumpled, faded photograph that Amanda had never seen in her entire life. Maxwell snatched the old photograph from Catherine's trembling fingers, his eyes widening in absolute paralyzing shock as he stared at the image of his late wife Emily, smiling brightly and hugging a young woman who looked exactly like Amanda. "Why in God's name is my dead wife embracing you in a photograph taken years ago when you boldly claimed you had never met my family?" Maxwell demanded, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of utter confusion and sudden agonizing betrayal. Amanda stared at the old picture, her hands shaking violently as the floor seemed to vanish beneath her feet, whispering in a breathy, terrified voice that the woman in the picture was not her, but her late mother Rose, who had died 4 years ago. A collective gasp echoed through the crowded bedroom, while Eleanor turned the color of spoiled milk, grabbing the edge of the dresser to physically support herself, her previous triumphant arrogance instantly evaporating into sheer, unadulterated panic. Later that night, while the massive estate remained shrouded in tense, suffocating darkness, Pearl, the elderly housekeeper, quietly slipped into Amanda's bedroom, holding a flickering candle, tears streaming steadily down her deeply wrinkled face. "Forgive me." "My child," Pearl sobbed quietly, explaining that seeing the hidden photograph had finally broken her silence, revealing the shocking truth that Emily and Rose were actually half-sisters, sharing the same wealthy father, making Amanda the biological niece of the late lady of the house. The weeping housekeeper confessed that their wealthy grandfather had left a massive secret inheritance to Rose's side of the family, but the cruel Eleanor had intercepted the legal documents, ruthlessly stealing the money and lands to hoard the fortune entirely for her own greedy lineage. Emily had accidentally discovered the stolen documents and confronted Eleanor at the top of the stairs, threatening to expose the theft and return the fortune to Amanda's mother, which resulted in the violent, fatal push that little Rachel had witnessed from the shadows. Amanda sat paralyzed on the edge of her bed, her mind spinning wildly as she realized she had to return to her tiny apartment in the distant town to retrieve her mother's old tin box, which she now knew contained the original undeniable proof of their stolen legacy. Unfortunately, the wicked Eleanor had been listening through the thin wooden door, and by the time the sun rose the next morning, she had orchestrated a devastating, flawless counterattack to eliminate the threat once and for all. Before breakfast, Eleanor gathered the entire household staff triumphantly, holding up Catherine's missing ring alongside Emily's famous diamond necklace, loudly claiming she had found the stolen jewels stuffed inside Amanda's mattress during a secondary midnight search. She venomously accused Amanda of being a manipulative con artist who had forged the old photograph and fabricated a fake bloodline simply to steal the family fortune, exploiting a grieving child to secure a permanent place in the wealthy household. Maxwell, deeply exhausted, profoundly confused, and blinded by the overwhelming pile of supposed evidence and his mother's convincing lies, looked at Amanda with a heartbreaking mixture of profound sorrow and intense anger, officially ordering her to leave his property immediately. The grand estate plunged instantly into an oppressive, suffocating darkness the moment Amanda walked out the front door, as if the very sun had refused to shine on the sprawling vineyards ever again. Rachel, completely shattered, locking herself inside her bedroom, refusing to eat a single bite of food, and plunging backward into a state of absolute terrifying silence, spending her days staring blankly out the window, waiting for her beloved Nanny to return. Watching his precious daughter wither away right before his eyes tore Maxwell's soul to shreds, filling his mind with agonizing, relentless doubts about the undeniable cruelty of his hasty decision to banish the only woman who had brought them genuine joy. Unable to sleep, Maxwell spent his nights wandering the dark, echoing halls like a lost phantom until an inexplicable urge drew him toward his late wife's locked, dusty study, a room he had adamantly refused to enter for 2 painful years. Tearing through the forgotten desk drawers in a desperate search for answers, his trembling fingers finally discovered a hidden compartment containing Emily's private leather-bound diary, securely tucked away beneath a stack of old financial ledgers. Reading the final pages under the dim light of a desk lamp, Maxwell's heart completely stopped as his eyes scanned his wife's frantic handwriting, detailing her shocking discovery of the stolen inheritance and her absolute joy at realizing she had a secret sister named Rose. The very last entry, dated merely hours before her tragic death, stated clearly that she planned to confront the tyrannical Eleanor and return the stolen fortune to her sister's family, ending with a chilling plea to God for protection against the old woman's legendary, ruthless wrath. The horrifying reality crashed over Maxwell like a devastating tidal wave. He had banished his own wife's blood niece, the true family his daughter desperately needed, and he had done it to protect a mother who was undeniably guilty of cold-blooded murder. Meanwhile, a massive, violent thunderstorm rolled aggressively into the California Valley, unleashing a torrential downpour of freezing rain and howling winds that battered the grand estate, rattling the heavy glass windows and plunging the property into terrifying chaos. Amidst the deafening thunder, a frantic maid sprinted down the grand staircase, screaming at the top of her lungs that the nursery window was wide open and little Rachel had completely vanished into the dangerous, pitch-black storm. Absolute panic erupted as the ranch hands saddled their horses and grabbed powerful flashlights, while Maxwell leaped into his luxury sedan, peeling out of the driveway with the engine roaring, his heart hammering against his ribs in sheer, unadulterated terror. He drove recklessly down the treacherous, muddy dirt road, sweeping the powerful headlights across the flooded fields, screaming his daughter's name into the roaring wind, praying to a God he had long ignored to spare his only child. Suddenly illuminated by a brilliant flash of jagged lightning, he spotted a tiny, soaked figure stumbling dangerously close to the crumbling edge of a deep swollen ravine where the muddy river raged violently below. "Rachel!" he screamed, slamming on the brakes and throwing the car door open. But the muddy ground gave way beneath the little girl's feet, sending her slipping backward toward the deadly, churning water. In that exact fraction of a second, another figure launched out of the blinding rain. Amanda, who had been hiking back to the estate, clutching her mother's tin box, dove directly into the treacherous mud without a single second of hesitation. She grabbed the child's tiny arm with incredible, desperate strength, ripping Rachel away from the crumbling edge just as the earth collapsed, pulling them both to safety as they rolled into the soaking wet grass. Maxwell fell to his knees in the freezing mud, pulling both the sobbing child and the gasping young woman into a massive, desperate embrace, weeping uncontrollably as he begged Amanda for her forgiveness over and over again. Amanda held the shivering girl tightly to her chest, looking directly into Maxwell's tear-streaked face, softly but firmly stating that they needed to get the freezing child inside immediately, but promising that the agonizing truth would finally be revealed tonight. They drove back to the brightly lit mansion where Eleanor and Catherine were waiting in the grand foyer, their faces dropping in absolute horror as the trio walked through the massive double doors dripping with mud and undeniable purpose. Maxwell commanded the entire household staff to gather immediately, his voice echoing like thunder inside the massive hall, declaring that no one would sleep until the toxic rot infecting their family was entirely exposed and surgically removed. Amanda stood before everyone and revealed certified documents proving that her late mother Rose was the rightful heir to half of the estate. She also presented a letter written by Emily showing that Amanda had never sought wealth, but had unknowingly returned to protect the family's true bloodline. When Eleanor tried to seize the evidence, Maxwell stopped her and exposed Emily's diary, which detailed Eleanor's financial crimes and violent threats. The final truth emerged when little Rachel bravely told everyone that she had witnessed her grandmother push Amanda down the stairs. As the shocked household looked on, Eleanor's lies collapsed completely. Catherine's attempt to escape also failed after the housekeeper exposed her role in framing Amanda, and Maxwell ordered her to leave forever. Moments later, Sheriff Davis arrived and arrested Eleanor for the crimes she had hidden for years. 8 months later, the once troubled California estate had become a joyful home filled with laughter. Rachel was thriving. Amanda inherited her rightful share of the fortune and donated most of it to a children's charity in memory of her mother and aunt, while she and Maxwell gradually fell in love and married in a simple ceremony, with Rachel proudly carrying the rings. Their story proved that love and truth can overcome betrayal, that real family is defined not only by blood, but by loyalty and sacrifice, and that healing begins when people choose compassion, honesty, and hope over fear, pride, and greed.